Can't wait, man. That's why I told you I wanted to fight this guy so bad.
Georges St Pierre is known for many things. His ground game, his strict training regimen, and his love of dinosaurs, to name a few. Trash talk isn't one of them. His most famous line,
I'm not impressed by your performance,
is famous for being so nice. GSP is the man that forgave his school bully and even gave him some money to help. He is the definition of nice. But George is human too. He can get frustrated, mad, and can hold a grudge. And now, at 44, he names 5 fighters he actually hated at one point in his career. Let's start things off with someone who delivered the greatest upset in UFC history. At number 5, we have Matt Serra. When Georges stepped into the cage at UFC 69, he felt like he hit the peak of his career. He had just defeated Matt Hughes, avenging his only professional loss and securing the welterweight title for the first time. At 25 years old, he felt invincible and openly admitted it was the first time he truly believed he was the best fighter in the world.
I remember everybody was telling me how good I am and this and that.
His opponent, Matt Serra, couldn't have been more overlooked. Serra had earned his title shot by winning the Ultimate Fighter's comeback season, and almost no one saw him as a legitimate threat, least of all GSP, who later admitted he barely trained properly and approached the fight with a level of arrogance he'd never shown before or since. That attitude proved costly. Serra stunned the MMA world by knocking St Pierre down early in the first round with a heavy right hand and quickly finished the fight with relentless ground and pound. What was supposed to be a simple title defense against a weak opponent became one of the biggest upsets in UFC history.
If I had a story in my life, it would have ended after that.
GSP called the loss the lowest point of his life and a brutal lesson in humility, one that forced him to completely rethink his approach to fighting.
I lost, period. I'm not used to that.
St Pierre didn't bounce back right away. He took months off from competition to carefully rebuild his mindset and his training environment from the ground up.
Have to regroup and change some stuff.
He brought in new coaches, tightened his discipline, and shifted the way he approached the sport. The result was obvious. When he returned to competition, he systematically dismantled both Josh Koscheck and Matt Hughes in dominating back-to-back wins. Those victories set the stage perfectly for his rematch against Serra at UFC 83, the promotion's first event in Canada and one of the most anticipated cards of all time. GSP knew this was his opportunity not only to reclaim his title, but also to prove to the fans, the critics, and especially to himself that his shocking defeat had been nothing more than an unfortunate accident. From the opening seconds of the fight, it was obvious St Pierre was on another level. He maintained complete control, breaking Serra down systematically with precise strikes and superior grappling. By the second round, Serra was mounted and helpless, absorbing vicious knees to the body until the referee stepped in to stop it. GSP had his revenge, reclaiming the welterweight title in a performance so dominant Serra later admitted, "I expected a war, but I got executed." GSP said the Serra loss affected him more than any other fight in his career. It left him angry, ashamed, and questioning his discipline. He avoided interviews that brought up Serra's name and admitted it triggered frustration even years later.
You were hunting my mind like constantly.
Shit.
His sports psychologist gave him a brick to carry in his gym bag. It served as a constant reminder not to get comfortable or overconfident. He carried that brick for a long time before realizing that the burden of it became too heavy, both metaphorically and literally. So one day, after training, he decided to let the loss go and throw the brick away.
Somewhere in Canada, there's a lake with a brick with my name on it.
He credited that loss with reshaping his career. The result forced him to adopt stricter habits, improve his focus, and rethink how he prepared for every opponent. Over time, the resentment faded. GSP eventually went on Serra's podcast, and the two were respectful toward each other. They never became close, but the tension dissolved once both men moved on. GSP acknowledged that Serra exposed a weakness he needed to fix. Today, GSP says he respects Serra for what happened, even if the memory still bothers him. The loss no longer defines him, but it never fully left him. Serra remains the only man to stop GSP with strikes. That fact still irritates him, even if he no longer shows it. In the fourth spot, we have Stockton's original gangster himself, Nick Diaz. Before Nick Diaz ever returned to the UFC, he was already one of the top welterweights in the world. He headlined Strikeforce cards, defended the title multiple times, and built a fan base off his pressure fighting and relentless pace. His 2011 win over Paul Daly was one of the most chaotic one-round fights in MMA history. It ended with Diaz standing over Daly after multiple knockdowns in both directions. That win cemented his place as the top name outside the UFC.
Diaz has learned to embrace his status as one of the sport's bad boys.
Georges St Pierre had already beaten every top contender in the UFC welterweight division by the time Diaz re-signed. The public wanted fresh blood, and Dana White pointed to Diaz as the next big threat. The clash of styles and personalities made the matchup easy to sell. The UFC booked them to fight at UFC 137, but Diaz was pulled after missing mandatory media events. Carlos Condit took his place, but GSP got injured and the fight never happened. The delay only increased tension between them.
I don't think George is hurt. I think he's scared.
Diaz beat BJ Penn and took over the post-fight mic to call out GSP directly.
What's up? Where you at, George?
GSP responded by asking Dana to rebook the fight. They tried again at UFC 143, but GSP tore his ACL in camp and the fight was canceled once more. Diaz fought Condit instead and lost. After the decision, he accused the judges, the UFC, and GSP himself of being part of a system that protected champions. GSP remained quiet, but said privately he was tired of the accusations and wanted the fight to happen. The UFC finally made it official for UFC 158 in 2013. The promotion leaned hard into the personal friction, and GSP admitted he asked for Diaz over Condit because he felt Diaz needed to be punished. Nick Diaz's UFC 158 buildup was as unpredictable as his career outside the octagon. Diaz missed media obligations, fired off accusations about steroids and payoffs, and kept reporters guessing if he'd even show up. The press conferences turned into shouting matches, with Diaz rambling, GSP losing patience, and the UFC scrambling to keep control.
You think I'm afraid of you, man? Are you crazy in your head, man?
Later, Diaz accused GSP of getting special treatment, skipping drug tests, and being pampered by the promotion. GSP, who almost never lost his cool in public, started showing real annoyance in interviews and open workouts. The tension followed both fighters through fight week. GSP told Dana White privately that he wanted Diaz taught a lesson, something he rarely said about anyone. He also called Diaz an uneducated fool in one of the promotional radio spots.
Left and right. Let me tell you something, uneducated fool. I've not always been rich.
And created an MMA meme that lives to this day. Even on weigh-in day, Diaz taunted GSP about cheating and called him a fake champion. Media outlets picked up on the bad blood, and UFC staff openly worried about Diaz missing another main event. When the fight finally happened, GSP shut Diaz down with takedowns and control, never letting the bout get chaotic. He kept his composure through all 5 rounds, even as Diaz tried to bait him with trash talk and gestures. It wasn't close on the scorecards, but the personal edge between the two was obvious right up to the final bell. Nick Diaz congratulated GSP in the octagon after UFC 158, but he seemed reluctant to do it. GSP raised Nick's hand at the end of the fight to show some sportsmanship, but the Diaz brother didn't look like he was overly excited. The truce, if you can call it that, did not last long. Within days, Diaz started claiming the result was tainted. He blamed the UFC for favoritism, suggested the judges and commission protected GSP, and said the win felt fake. He accused GSP of abusing IVs and steroids, bringing up allegations he'd hinted at during fight week. On the Joe Rogan Experience, GSP called Diaz the most disrespectful human being I've ever met. He shrugged off the steroid talk and told Rogan he had nothing to hide. GSP mocked the accusations by pretending to admit to all of them. Over the years, Diaz repeated the same accusations anytime GSP's name came up. He accused him of ducking a rematch, cheating, and hiding behind the system. GSP, usually one of the most patient fighters in the sport, responded with visible irritation in interviews. He rarely raised his voice, but always dismissed Nick's comments as nonsense. Eventually, the tension faded as Diaz drifted away from the UFC spotlight. The drama cooled as Nick faced suspensions and new opponents. He mostly stopped talking about GSP, and any bad blood became background noise. When they're mentioned together today, both men keep it cordial. There is no real friendship, but no lingering feud. With the Diaz brother, that's as close to closure as it gets. At number 3, it's the former middleweight champion, Michael Bisping. As soon as this fight was scheduled, people knew that the buildup would be insane.
I'm gonna do the biggest fight as possible, and I want to make
What gives a fuck?
Bisping brought his usual showmanship to every press conference and interview, calling GSP a fraud and turning media events into comedy routines at GSP's expense. He constantly interrupted, joked about GSP's accent, and made light of his clean-cut image.
What do you know that I don't know? A lot of things.
The UFC leaned into the clash of personalities, marketing it as a battle between Bisping, the outspoken brawler, and GSP, the quiet technician. As fight week in New York approached, the media attention reached a fever pitch. Bisping ramped up his antics, mocking GSP's discipline and calling his entire legacy overrated. He did everything possible to get under GSP's skin at every face-off, and at certain points, it looked like he was succeeding.
That's when you know I'm pissing George off, because he does this.
The press labeled it as the noisiest buildup of GSP's career, with Bisping determined to turn every moment into a headline. Through it all, GSP leaned on his coaches and training partners, blocking out as much media as possible and giving minimal answers at press events. Privately, he admitted the mind games wore him down, but he refused to let Bisping see him rattle. The tension was obvious. Even veteran reporters said they had never seen GSP so visibly irritated before a fight. He arrived at open workouts stone-faced, clearly just wanting to finish business and go home. Bisping laughed it off for the cameras, telling anyone who would listen that GSP was cracking under the pressure.
If he loses, I'm going to retire.
On Fight Night, GSP looked prepared for every scenario. He matched Bisping's pace, handled the physical demands of a bigger opponent, and stayed calm through early adversity. The fight was brutal and fast-paced, with both men landing heavy shots and each having moments where they threatened to take control. But once GSP found his rhythm, there was no doubt about the outcome. GSP left Madison Square Garden with another UFC title, becoming just the 4th fighter in history to hold belts in 2 divisions. He answered every question about his age, weight, and time off in one night. Bisping, battered but honest, admitted the fight was never close once GSP settled in.
Do you believe that?
Well, I'd say so. Yeah, good for him. You know what I mean?
Reporters pressed GSP afterward about the feud, but he kept his answers short, giving Bisping credit as a true champion while admitting that the mind games had pushed him harder mentally than any opponent since his first title run. Bisping moved on from the rivalry with his usual sense of humor, calling the loss humbling and saying he learned from GSP's discipline. The two even traded podcast invites in the months that followed, joking about the chaos of their press tour. GSP never forgot how Bisping tried to get under his skin, but he used it as motivation, going back to retirement satisfied that he'd answered every critic and silenced one of the loudest mouths in the history of MMA. And speaking of loudmouths, coming in at number 2, it's Josh Koscheck. So, Bisping was a trash talker who eventually won fans over. Our pick here, Koscheck took the opposite path. He started as a villain on The Ultimate Fighter and never shook the label. The rivalry began before their first fight. Koscheck went after GSP in interviews, dismissing him as overhyped and manufactured by the UFC. Josh believed he was the better fighter and that he would knock GSP with relative ease.
I would say I knock him out within the first 2 minutes of this fight.
He said GSP was all image and no grit, laying the groundwork for years of bad blood. Their first bout came at UFC 74 in 2007. GSP out-wrestled Koscheck, controlling the fight and winning by decision. After the fight, Koscheck called the win boring, insisted GSP was playing it safe, and said he'd expose him in a rematch. Things escalated on The Ultimate Fighter 12, where GSP and Koscheck coached opposite teams. Koscheck leaned into the villain role, mocking GSP's accent and coaching style. He ridiculed GSP's calm demeanor and told the cast he was the only real athlete in the house. GSP stayed composed on camera, but later said Koscheck reminded him of the bullies he grew up with. Privately, he admitted this rivalry felt personal in a way most didn't. By the time UFC 124 came around, GSP was done playing games. He trained to outclass Koscheck completely and prove a point. Koscheck never missed a chance to antagonize GSP after their second fight. He dismissed GSP's dominant performance at UFC 124, saying GSP was afraid to finish and just wanted to play it safe. Even with a broken orbital bone, Koscheck insisted he was still the better fighter and demanded another shot.
Koscheck's a dick. Let's just face it. I mean, the guy's a dick.
Despite all of this, GSP was unmoved. He told media he got satisfaction from hurting Koscheck without showing it. He didn't want a third fight. He said Koscheck's disrespect had built up for years and there was nothing left to prove. Koscheck spent months recovering from the injury, but he kept the rivalry alive in interviews. He mocked GSP's style, questioned his toughness, and claimed the belt should have changed hands. Fans picked sides, but the animosity never faded. The UFC never booked a trilogy. GSP had made his point and moved on, but Koscheck kept referencing their history every chance he got. Years later, when GSP discussed fighters he genuinely disliked, Koscheck's name still came up. Unlike with other rivals, there was never a reconciliation or thaw. Koscheck remained a villain in GSP's story, and their dynamic stayed tense even long after both men left the title picture. And the number one fighter GSP hated the most is definitively Johnny Hendricks. To fully understand this beef and George's dislike of Johnny Hendricks, we need to firmly establish where he was in his career at this point. Leading up to UFC 167, GSP was already seen as the greatest of all time in many people's eyes. Remember, Anderson Silva's reign was over, JonJones was still a few years away from defeating everyone under the sun, and Mighty Mouse, well, no one was calling Demetrius the best at that time. GSP had defended his title 9 times, beaten every worthy challenger, and built a reputation for himself.
His strength was being extremely good everywhere.
Granted, a lot of people were calling him boring even back then, but he was respected for the way he shut down elite strikers, out-wrestled top grapplers, and almost never lost a round. And then there was Johnny Hendricks. The UFC hyped him as the most dangerous challenge yet. A left hand with knockout power, a real NCAA wrestling pedigree, and the kind of momentum that got fighters main events. Hendricks knocked out John Fitch, finished Martin Kampmann, and put together a run nobody could ignore. The talk before UFC 167 was simple. Could GSP avoid Hendricks' power? And could Hendricks stop GSP's takedowns? Even the other welterweights watched with interest.
Yeah, so GSP versus Johnny Hendricks.
Most picked GSP, but almost everyone admitted Hendricks was the kind of threat that could end a legendary run.
The best welterweight in the world, George St Pierre.
Everything was set for a title fight that would be remembered as the toughest, bloodiest, and most controversial of GSP's career. From the opening bell, Hendricks came after GSP like nobody before him, and since. He stunned GSP in the first round with a series of heavy left hands, busted him up in the clinch, and shrugged off most takedown attempts. For once, GSP looked vulnerable in every exchange. The fight became a war of attrition. GSP scored with jabs and high kicks, but absorbed more damage than he ever had in a title fight. By round 5, both men were exhausted and marked up, but Hendricks was the fresher, heavier hitter. The final bell sounded, and nobody in the arena seemed certain who won. When the judges read the scorecards, the crowd was stunned. Split decision. Georges St Pierre. Hendricks stood in disbelief, shaking his head. DanaWhite looked furious at Cage-A-Side. In the post-fight press conference, he called the judging atrocious and insisted that Hendricks deserved the belt. Fighters and media echoed the outrage. Social media exploded with accusations of robbery. Even longtime GSP fans admitted it was the closest they had ever seen him come to losing. GSP, battered and bleeding, didn't celebrate. He announced he was stepping away from MMA, leaving the welterweight division without its champion.
I need to relax. I need to get out for a while, you know.
The fallout kicked off one of the most heated controversies in UFC history and marked the start of an unresolved grudge that lingers to this day. After GSP walked away from the sport, talk quickly shifted from judging to drug testing. GSP told media he believed Johnny Hendricks was using PEDs during their title fight. He went on record with lines like, "I don't have the evidence, and I didn't want to attack a particular individual." Georges said he wanted to change the system and clean up MMA. Still, he heavily implied that he believed Johnny was on performance-enhancing drugs. GSP's coach certainly thought so.
Guys, I do think he was on PDs. Yeah, I do.
Hendricks fired back, calling it sour grapes and insisting GSP was only ducking a fair rematch. Soon after, the UFC announced it would introduce full-scale USADA testing. This move put the whole welterweight division under a microscope. Hendricks, who had been a powerhouse at 170, suddenly began to struggle with weight cuts and his results inside the cage. Fans and journalists noted his physical changes and the sharp decline in his performances. GSP never publicly gloated about Hendricks' downfall, but he didn't need to. In interviews, he often referenced certain fighters who declined after USADA, with obvious implications. He credited the experience for shaking his faith in the sport's integrity and said it was a major factor in his decision to step away from MMA. Hendricks, for his part, denied everything but never returned to his old form. He left the UFC on a losing streak, and when GSP was asked about fighters he couldn't stand, Hendricks' name always came up first. GSP rarely talks about hate, but these 5 names never left his mind. They brought out the worst in him and forced him to look at fighting and himself in a new way. Some he respects now, others he keeps at a distance. For Georges, old grudges never fully disappear. Like and subscribe if you want more stories like this, and tell us which fighter you would have added to GSP's list.